All right, final video lesson to cover what we would have been talking about in class today. I just wanted to make a few comments about leading and influencing. This is a huge, huge topic and not one that we can really do justice in like a 15-minute video, but just some food for thought. And then also to let you know that I posted on Canvas under today's class module some slides that provide some background information from Globe, which I think I mentioned on the first or second day of class, that Globe, kind of one of the big reasons Globe got launched was to, in fact, look at variations in leadership around the globe. So a little bit of it was to replicate and extend Hofsche's values framework, but it was also really led by Bob House, who's somebody, he's deceased now, but someone who is a kind of major leadership scholar, particularly looking at charisma and charismatic leadership. So he had some interest in trying to understand whether charisma was kind of seen the same around the world, if it was as effective around the world, etc. So that was kind of a little backdrop with that. But nevertheless, on Canvas there's a deck of slides. So as you're looking at both your mini cases this afternoon and your foreign country manual project, you can look there too as, again, a little bit of source of resource on some of the variations and expectations for leadership around the world. So in this little final lesson, I'm going to talk a little bit about leading and influencing, right? And one of the things that's important to think about when we take leadership and go intercultural is that leaders who are culturally intelligent don't just mimic the leaders of other behaviors. They look at what's effective in cross-cultural situations. And again, that's especially true when we think about multicultural teams. So you had a couple readings about that. The complexity just rises because now, you can't just behave like you expect will be effective as a leader in Russia when you have a team that has Russians and Japanese and Brazilians on it, right? So it isn't as simple as like knowing what people do in those other places and just acting like that. It's important to think about looking at modeling effective leadership and understanding what the commonalities are, because there are quite a few. And then the other piece is to look at the idea of influence, because leadership is really ultimately about trying to influence the behavior of others. So just kind of quickly to cover a little bit of this, I want to go through a few slides about what we know. So probably in some other course you've encountered some of this idea that there's different tactics of influence. And one of the things that we can do is sort of break these down between so-called soft tactics and so-called hard tactics, and then kind of rational. Rational persuasion is using facts, data, and evidence to try to convince people what you want them to do. It's important to use that, but it's usually not the thing that's going to really drive motivation, which is usually appealing to purpose and meaning and mastery, if you think about intrinsic motivation drivers. The so-called soft tactics are interpersonal, they're relationship focused. I don't like the difference between soft and hard, but I think they're sort of interpersonal, that's trying to build relationship, and then there's interpersonal on the hard tactic that's much more pressure focused, relying on authority, relying on power, etc. So that's kind of the basic difference in classic influence tactics. More importantly for this situation, I just want to share that there is research that tactics vary across cultures and their usefulness varies across cultures. So this is one research paper that, just so you know how it was done, they gave people little vignettes to read, and each of those scenarios kind of included different influence tactics, and then people are asked to rate the effectiveness of this, like how likely it is that they or others would follow this and be influenced by the attempt. And then they did this around the world. And what they found was, I think kind of an important takeaway, was that rational persuasion, collaboration, and consultation were universally effective. So even in directive high power distance situations, those are very useful tactics to try to involve people. Generally speaking, just this kind of small talk and chit chat, gift giving, that reciprocity matters, but they were less effective across all cultures. And pressure wasn't either. So even if we think about top-down decision making and expectations of power distance, pressure still is not a very effective tactic. And then others sort of varied with the direction of what you were trying to do with the influence. So short answer is influence tactics vary, and the effectiveness of different tactics will vary based on cultures. But I think the big takeaway I have is that there are some that are universally effective. And so your best bet is to try to use these as your go-to techniques, because then you're likely to have success influencing others, even if there are cultural differences at play. One other type of or approach to influence tactics is this idea of the principles of persuasion by Bob Cialdini. I present and teach this in my version of 6110, Leading Others. This is also what the basis for Vlad's classes on influence, coming more from a marketing standpoint, but definitely also interpersonal influence processes. And I would recommend, if you're not familiar with these, you can take a look at, there are short articles, there are podcasts by Bob and others, and his books are very good as well. But basically, his research has shown that if we kind of just look across humans, and he uses the basis of evolutionary psychology, there are 6 tactics or principles of persuasion that seem to work almost universally. That these are things that when you do, people have a greater sense of obligation and are more likely to comply or say yes to a request, which is what is the heart of persuasion. And so liking is just having personal connections, and you can already kind of imagine that in relationship-based cultures, that's going to even be more important, and you're going to be more influential if you build those social relationships with your work colleagues. Reciprocity, it's the indebtedness that if I do you a favor, you'll do me a favor. That's somewhat where gift giving comes from, but I think more it's backup behavior at work and helping behavior at work. Social proof is showing that others are doing it. So this is, cue your mind to think probably effective in collective societies, certainly effective even in individualistic societies, but might be a go-to principle when kind of in-group collectivism matters, and that sense of shared, shared destiny and shared purpose. Consistency is, what trying to get people to maybe agree to small things that build to larger things, kind of foot in the door tactics for negotiation, for example. Authority, straightforward, right? You do it because I tell you because I'm the boss. Obviously, authority will be more effective in high power distance settings. And scarcity is just the principle that when there's less of something available, people tend to want more. And so if you can show them, for instance, that an opportunity that you want them to participate in is rare and they may not get this chance again, and it's very few people get the opportunity to do this kind of thing, that can be very persuasive. So I apologize for making a very quick tour of those influence tactics, but some of it is my assumption that in your core Leading Others class you've seen those things before. Mostly I also don't want to have another video here that's 40 minutes long for you to watch today. So to kind of cut to the chase here, another piece of research, Cialdini has done some work looking at those principles of persuasion around the world, and what he has found and others have supported is that all of them, all 6 of those principles, are effective anywhere. But again, how you do that might be a little bit different, so you need to kind of be good anthropologists and observe behavior, watch people who are successful at leading and influencing others, and then think about how they're implementing those different tactics. At the same time, the sort of relative use and effectiveness will vary around the world. So if we think about in the US, Reciprocation is a big one, and that's not gift giving. It's just this idea of, you owe me one, and I'll help you, because I want to help you, but as a result, I'll also expect that I can call that favor in at some time. So that kind of egalitarian shared responsibility is very common as a persuasion tactic in the U.S. China, not surprising, very command, top-down economy and culture. Authority is used more often there. There's sort of an expectation of leaders to use authority as a basis for persuading. Spain and other heavy relationship-focused societies, from like the trusting standpoint, liking and friendship really matters, which is why in cultures that are more relationship-based, there's a lot more emphasis and need for spending time at lunch, spending time out of work, sharing personal details, making that interpersonal connection before you attempt influence. In Germany, consistency, kind of that low uncertainty avoidance, makes that the go-to tactic. Okay, so now getting into leadership itself, just a few high-level things to think about. This is a table from the Globe Project, and essentially, from this massive research study they found that there are many things that are universals in terms of leadership effectiveness. So if we think about this, being trustworthy, right? But here's the thing, how you show that you're trustworthy varies, right? So if you're a task-based culture, trustworthiness is going to be more calculative and task-focused, whereas in a relationship-based culture, it's going to be more based on the social connection that you have with your followers. It may bleed into almost a paternalistic kind of caring for your employees. So trustworthy matters, but just be aware that kind of how you achieve that is going to vary, and some of the material we've covered in class should give you some insights about maybe how that might happen. Planning matters. This sort of idea of vision and visionary makes a difference, but again, the expectations of how concrete plans are will vary around the world. Good communicators, no matter what, is a good thing. And then there's also some things that they found were universally bad, if you will. So being loner, asocial, self-protective, not good. Non-cooperative, malevolent, not good. Dictatorial. So even in top-down societies, people do not really want an autocratic leader. They still want some kind of relationship and connection, and some approach to consensus building, whether that's sort of as a part of the decision or as a part of the implementation is a bit of a different story. And you can take some of what we learned in the other lessons to think about how that works. And then finally, I guess I made my line here too long, there's definitely some very contingent things. So how autonomous you are, not loner, but how autonomous you are sort of in making decisions, for example, will vary. How status conscious and how the use of power symbols are displayed is going to vary. And how much of a risk taker you're going to be. Again, you can think about connections and analogs to things like uncertainty avoidance here as places where that contingency might arise. From our cultural intelligence textbook, Thomas and Inkson quote some research that shows that really, no matter where in the world you are, if you're relationship focused, you're going to have better outcomes. So even in a tactical, task-focused society like the U.S., people still want to have a relationship with their leaders. So building social connections is always going to do well in terms of thinking about being an effective leader. But the cautionary note always stands that how you demonstrate relationship orientation varies across cultures. What's considered personal and private, you're going to have to think through those kind of expectations as you think about how to demonstrate relationship development with your followers. Again, another just way to look at a list of these universally desirable leadership behaviors. So if you think about being effective cross-culturally, use and employ versions of these and think about how you need to communicate and develop these attributes across cultures, and you will have some effectiveness. So finally, just kind of quickly through the contingents things, there's at least there's at least 6 elements of leader behaviors that are contingent across cultures. So they did find in the study that charisma, that kind of how you inspire people and whether people expect leaders to be inspirational, will vary. Team-oriented leadership, this is a bit of, how much participation, how much consensus seeking, again, should sound familiar from decision-making, evaluating, trusting kinds of perspectives. Humane-oriented leadership, so how much you need to care for your people and show care that maybe extends beyond the workplace. I already mentioned that idea of paternalism. There are some countries, you could search for some articles, very interesting to read about paternalistic leadership, and think about where and which domains of life leaders are expected to comment on and try to influence. Sort of autonomy, right? Whether leaders should be autonomous and sort of unique and individualistic varies along with individualism, but also with power distance. So higher power distance, there's a bit greater expectation of autonomy and direction coming from leaders. And then self-protective, again, I think that kind of hints a little bit on paternalism, is how much the leader is supposed to care about the general safety and well-being of self and others and organization. Again, I think worldwide, certainly to some degree that's happening, but how that ends up being displayed by a leader is going to vary. So charismatic leadership, it's sort of the inspirational view of leaders, and most, in a lot of cultures, charisma is seen as something that is associated with leadership and with effective leaders. But there is variation in how much this is expected and how much this sort of works to motivate followers. And if you look at the globe country clusters that I provided last week when we looked at country frameworks, the highest score, both for how much leaders display charisma and how much it is seen as an effective trait of leaders, is in the Anglo cluster. And it's lowest in Middle East, although if you look at it, it is a statistically significant difference, but those mean values, I would say my takeaway is charisma is still effective and valued, even in the lower clusters like the Middle East. Team-oriented, again, this is sort of how much there is an expectation that consensus and team activity is seen as contributing to outstanding leadership. The highest score is in the Latin American cluster, and I think this is where we have the highest relationship-oriented expectations for the language of friendship and trusting, and lowest in Middle East. But again, I think you can see here these are subtle variations, and apart from being a little bit careful about consensus seeking and participation and showing oneself as an expert in a high power distance setting, participation in teamwork is valued, especially in business cultures, most places. Participative, again, highest. Interestingly, in Germanic Europe, and Germany is known as a place where there's extreme participation in decision-making and the expectation that leaders will consult followers. This is sometimes a little surprising because Germany also is fairly high power distance and kind of a fairly top-down decision structure, but how that gets implemented is still through a lot of participation through the planning process. And I think this is also at least due in part to high uncertainty avoidance, and wanting to make sure that things are thoroughly and consistently vetted before decisions are taken ahead. So humane-oriented, again, I think really worldwide, humane orientation is an important aspect of leadership, But, some of this is, again, how much is displayed. Is the leader supposed to be somewhat emotionally restrained and rational, or more social, connected, and emotional? And there is variation here as well. And again, not surprising if you think about it, the lowest here is Nordic Europe. So Scandinavia, where leaders, I think, are supposed to project as consensual, seeking consensus, seeking participation, but rational arbiters, facilitators of processes, for example, and not necessarily getting involved in the personal life of employees. And autonomous, again, how individualistic leaders are. Highest is Eastern Europe. So I think you can think about command and control economies and communism as at least one way to think about this, that there's a sense that leaders make independent decisions and that they should do that, and that they are the people who are experts, and therefore doing other than that would undermine that authority and that expertise. Lowest is Latin America, again, much more relationship-focused societies. And finally, how much do leaders save face? How much are they, unlikely to admit error? How much are they, likely to kind of maintain positions even in the face of critical feedback? That self-protective style is going to be high in Southern Asia and lowest in Nordic Europe. But again, I caution here, this is a 7-point scale, so it's a pretty impedimentary approach no matter where you are. So this is not something that anywhere in the world is going to be a particularly effective approach to leadership. So, finally, I think if you think about CQ, culturally intelligent leadership, you definitely need to build this knowledge. So it's kind of a final wrap here. It's important to study these kinds of things and recognize that there are many, many aspects of leadership that are universal, and those should be your go-tos. Those should be what you try to do. But of course, you have to be that anthropologist. You have to have your mindfulness. You have to have your cruise control off and watch people who are effective, because how they conduct themselves and how they do those effective styles of leadership will probably vary in subtle ways. And that takes time for you to pick up on, learn, and develop those skills to adapt. You need to know yourself and your preferred style. So any opportunities to do self-assessments, we have an outstanding leadership class that's offered in a compressed format. I know that some of you have taken that class already, but that's a place where you're going to do a whole lot of self-assessment and learning, and that will be valuable to you in a domestic and an international setting. So do that. Seek feedback. Ask people for help in your development plan. Think about who can give you feedback about how you're doing, who you can bounce ideas off of, who you can practice things with, and who can give you that sort of mentorship to continue to develop your leadership effectiveness both in a U.S. setting and in a global setting. Try to think about managing your emotions. This is the adjustment part. Getting less fearful, doing some CBT kind of before you go into a situation, doing a little bit of, post hoc analysis when you're done. And think about, walking across that bridge. You should never think about crossing it entirely and trying to be like them, but find the points of contact, find the points of similarity. And you will go a long way in terms of improving your overall, particularly I think, efficacy and confidence in leading in cross-cultural situations. One final slide here, I think, to take a look at from Aaron Meyer's work is, again, egalitarianism versus hierarchical, top-down versus low power distance, how places and countries map. And in egalitarian cultures, there's low distance between boss and subordinate. The best boss is a facilitator. It's kind of what I said about that Swedish sort of, practical like facilitator. Organizational structures are flat. So if you see that, you'll also know that's a kind of a cue. It's more likely to be expectations about egalitarianism. And interestingly, in egalitarian cultures, there's less of a taboo of skipping hierarchical lines or sort of going up and talking to a higher level boss. People aren't as threatened by that kind of activity, for example. And then in hierarchical, there's high power distance. The manager or leader is seen as a strong director who leads from the front. Status and showing symbols of status and power are important. Most organizations are multi-layered and the structure is fixed, and there's an expectation that you will follow the chain of command. So for instance, if you're working in a high power distance culture and you're working with some relatively low level, entry-level engineers or designers, you may just ask them some questions and they may not answer, and you may think that they're obfuscating, but in fact they are honoring the command chain of the organization, and they may feel like they aren't in the position to share the information, that it would be their boss or someone higher up who'd need to do that. So if you feel that kind of what starts to feel like no one's answering your question, instead of assuming they don't know the answer, they may, but they feel like it's not their place to tell you. So that's another way to think about processing this. So this kind of continuum here again gives you a little help. US is sort of in the middle here. We're kind of moderate power distance. But again, always remember the relative quality here, right? So, Poles are pretty hierarchical, but they're going to feel out of place if they go to Korea, and where things are extremely high power distance. So same thing, we tend to feel ourselves a little bit more on the egalitarian side, but if we start to go work in Scandinavia, in the US, we may really feel like things are really consultative, and the Netherlands, combine that with that blunt and direct feedback. We may feel that authority is being challenged all the time, but in fact it's just kind of the expectation of what leaders do, and that it's more of a consensus-driven participation, facilitation process than a top-down directive process. So with that, I'm going to conclude these exercises and lessons for today, and take a look at the extra materials posted on Canvas. There's a lot of other background information on leadership and leadership styles and how those map onto dimensions like globe that you can think about for completing your mini cases this afternoon, and for some reference material for your foreign country manual. Thank you.